Hello. So last time I built this house, and it was meant to be part one of a somewhat secretive story build. And I know it's been a while since this one. I have now finished this entire build, and I'm doing something a bit different. And I've actually written like a whole story that goes along with this build. So it's going to be in a few parts. They're all complete, so the story is complete. I wanted to make sure that it was all cohesive beforehand. So I want to introduce you to the two characters who we're going to move in here initially. And one of them is someone I'm naming Biodiversity Bernard, and his wife Absent Anna. And Biodiversity Bernard is a little self-explanatory. He's a biodiversity biologist. Absent Anna is a little bit less self-explanatory, and we'll figure out why I've named her that as we go through the story. But if you like the idea of what is essentially a bit of a Black Mirror episode that uses The Sims as a canvas, stick around. If you like stories of success, fortune, and positivity, this might not be for you. So I'm really excited to try something a bit different with this one and see what you think. I'm always trying to think about who lives in or uses whatever build I'm doing, and adding little details to give hints of some kind of story or lore. But I actually love to write full stories, so I'm going to combine that with building now, and we'll see how that goes. I've created a full plot line to go with this build, so that will progress as we move through this from room to room, and this video for part 1 will be Act 1 of 3. So I'm going to go along and do this build, and I'm going to talk a little bit less than I usually do about what we're building and actually sort of go through this story that is occurring in this build as we move along through it from room to room. So a few things before we begin. And the first is that I've already been through the interior of this build, and I've sort of done the infrastructure. So we've got lots of beams. We've got sort of staircases in here already. The walls are sort of this base thing it's not going to, the walls won't stay like this. We'll change those as we go through as well. But the infrastructure and layout of this build is already in place, so that when we go through, we're just mostly decorating it and improving on what's already here, rather than placing all of these pillars and posts and things over and over again. And the thing too is that the house that we are building is going to be how the house appears at the very end of the story when we reach that in part 3. But the story that I will be telling as we go through is sort of like historic, a bit more set in the past. And as we go through, we'll be revealing this manor to be far more than it first appears, and becoming more twisted as we go through. So we're going to begin with the entry. And the way I'm going to structure this is by just giving you sort of an overview of what we're going to do in the room first, and then telling you the story. So I've already made like a palette and a staircase here. It's going to be all quite dark wood with some light tones as well. I quite like the combination of that. And we're going to be decorating these walls here using some decals, whatever they're called, from the Felix Estate collection. I really wanted to make this look very grand. This is a whole like 2-story area. There's all beams all above us. And I wanted to make this little bit of a blend of country manor with some more regal but sort of haunting manor vibes. I was thinking a little bit of the manor from Resident Evil, if you know that Lady Dimitrescu lives in. And if you don't know that game, you've probably seen Lady Dimitrescu, this like really giant tall woman in a white dress with a giant white hat. And we're going to extend that around the house, making something quite warm, but also polished and a little bit stern. So now we're going to begin with the story. I've already introduced you to Bernard and Anna, and Bernard inherits this house after his parents passed away in an auction house crowd crush, which is just really a convenient plot device to get them out of the picture and explain how Bernard has such an enormous house as a simple biologist. But he moves in here with Anna, who is a nurse. And Anna is sort of the main feature at the beginning of this story, because she's always had unusual feelings about this house, even when Bernard's parents owned it and lived there. But she kept all those feelings to herself. But really, she found it too large, and she thought it was cold, and it was all woody smelling. And she thought, it was beautiful in its structure and very impressive. But something about the historic features, the, beams and wood, and she found all of that quite overwhelming, the history of the house, even though that was obviously the selling feature for most. For her, it was just it was off-putting. So she's always reminded of the manor's age everywhere she looks. And she felt that made the atmosphere feel quite heavy somehow. And she also had some bad memories of Bernard's parents always bringing up the vastness of the place, and she called that was them peacocking. And she's made Bernard promise that he's not going to let this newfound wealth get to his head in the same way. But Bernard doesn't value the house for it being a large, fancy house. He values it because he's got lots of space to set up his work and the grounds that were obviously perfect for studying biodiversity in a local ecosystem. So much of the decor as we go through this is inherited. It used to be owned by Bernard's parents, but Bernard and Anna do make some additions to reflect their style as well, particularly flowers for Anna, and Bernard mostly just spreads all of his reading material around the place in a way that Anna finds chaotic, but in which Bernard somehow finds order by spreading topics into various different rooms of the house. And our next stop is just going to be around the corridor off from the entryway, and it's going to be the living room or sitting room. And I wanted this to be quite excessive with the number of chairs and sofas and surfaces and rugs to really express that kind of maximalist wealth in this manor. So I'm using some CC wall pieces to create some custom built fireplace and some custom wall panels and window ledges. I'm going to use quite regal warm tones along with a classical nature themed wallpaper that's in there, and I'm going to match the curtains with that as well. And I like the contrast of light and dark in the entry, so I continued with a combination of that in this room with some older dark wood alongside some more uplifting creams. And I wanted this very much to be a comfort room with plenty of natural light through those large windows that sort of pan around the perimeter of the grounds outside. But much of the furniture in this room is from various auctions and fancy furniture shops, collecting sort of individual pieces rather than sets. Hence, the living room is just a collection of different sofas and surfaces. And Bernard settles into this house really swiftly, because this was his childhood home, obviously, after all. Anna takes a little more time. She's never really shifting that feeling of unease in the house. And eventually, Anna and Bernard have a child. So since their initials are A and B, they thought it would be a nice idea to choose a name beginning with C for their child, who turned out to be a boy. So they called him Callum, and although obviously delighted by their new addition to the family, while still somewhat struggling to settle into the house, Anna found the change of motherhood to be quite shocking and decided to leave her work as a nurse to focus on the family. She wanted to provide the best she could for Callum, but somehow a baby plus getting used to the new house, the ability to get used to both of those things conflicted with each other. Anna chose Callum to focus on, restricting her interaction somewhat with the house by mostly just enclosing herself into this living room with its windows on three sides, lots of light and more natural theme. It felt least house-like of all of the manor's rooms. Much of Callum's infancy was spent in this room, gazing out of the windows and observing the surrounding grounds, his young mind developing an interest somewhat in his father's footsteps, and Anna, focusing entirely on Callum, neglected her own mental health. But she dealt with it for a while, even enough to occasionally jest with Bernard, including buying him a statue of a peacock, which we're going to see placed in this room, declaring that her son would never be allowed to become one, and the only one allowed in the house would be this one, which Bernard laughed at the humour and equally accepted the piece as a statement decoration. The species of bird, obviously, being a marvel of biodiversity and evolution, and Anna eventually progressed beyond the living room from a combination of reasons, which none were an improvement to her mental health. The first reason was that her son's desire to explore as he aged, and the second was her noticing something that made her question the house even further. So spending so much time in the living room, she'd become very familiar with the consistency of it and the items within it, but Anna began to notice as she entered each day that some of the items had moved, and not just moved, but changed in a way she couldn't explain and didn't really want to. So we're going to take a little look at the finished living room. So, leaving the living room and leading you back through the entry to another room which is just off from that entryway, and we enter the dining room. So I've already separated this room into two areas. We're gonna have the fancier dining table being more central, and then a breakfast table through the arches, which is more the table that sees the most use, I think, in this house. The fancier table is more for, dinner parties, formal dinners, and it's a whole, table set that it was inherited from Bernard's somewhat socialite parents who used to use the table now, but now it sits there more, gathering dust, because Bernard and Anna aren't particularly social party throwers. But they do more enjoy sitting, next to the windows and having some light in, so the breakfast table's a lot more homely and making it a lot more sort of rustic. And we're going to continue in this room with some of the cream tiles and stone to customize the walls and really give them that manor grandness around the lower fancy area of the house. But then I'm going to bring in more wood around the breakfast table and create a sort of lighter, cozier theme and a nice little nook beside the windows. And then we're going to put in some curtains which are going to separate those two areas that, presumably would have been drawn during parties to hide the less flaunty furniture on the other side when Bernard's parents owned the place. But the dining room was the first to enter Anna's expanded radius of living within the manor, with Callum wanting to partake in more messy activities such as painting or taking half an hour to consume a meal after flinging it across the room. A dining room was easier to clean than a living room rug. So she often found herself wondering why she was always the one supervising him and cleaning up the mess. Of course she knew that, Bernard had all of his work to do around the place, typically more on the upper levels of the house, which she preferred not to go to at this point in time, because she felt like they were just further away from the entry, or, the escape exit, as she often considered it. She wondered at this point if leaving her job as a nurse had actually been a benefit to her, or if she would have maybe eventually actually become used to the house if she'd had the ability to escape from it for periods of time. She adored Callum, obviously, but sometimes she did feel like a bit of a prisoner. But Bernard did eventually step up, as Callum became more and more interested in the grounds, specifically the nature within it. And Bernard would take Callum to the pond to collect samples of water, and Anna would watch him from behind the wall, often ordering Bernard to be careful because Callum tended to walk straight forward until his wellies were entirely submerged in the water. Meanwhile, she would tend the gardens, admiring the flowers, collecting the scented ones to take back inside and place within the various vases around the manor. She figured the delightful scents might counter that historic wooden stench and make her feel a bit more at home. Of course, after each harvesting session was over, Bernard would haul his pond water upstairs and leave Anna with a disgruntled child who wanted to continue to help his father in whatever investigative research he was off to undertake, but wasn't old enough to be trusted. But once he was old enough to join Bernard upstairs, Anna's involvement with Callum drastically declined. Bernard wanted to be with his research all of the time, and Callum, just like his father, wanted to be included. Anna's time with her son became solely educating him as he turned school age. The rest of the time, she was just left alone in the house. So let's have a little look at the finished dining room before we move on. So, beginning to stray away from that fancier look that we've done everywhere else in the house, we're going to go into the kitchen, which is off the side of the dining room, and we're going to make this a lot more country rustic style. It's still going to be very nice, obviously, but Bernard's parents generally didn't use the kitchen since they used to have staff and a cook, so they didn't decorate it with the same kind of showy antiques and details and, as all the other rooms in the house. So we're going to have walls here that reveal a lot more of the natural brick of the manor, as they haven't been layered with all of these fancy panels and papers that we've got in all the other rooms. And we're going to go with a sort of original looking stonework floor. For the kitchen, worktops and cupboards, We're going to design them with a mix of sets to create what I think is like a kind of country style mix and match aesthetic of 3 different colors. And we're going to keep the dark wood and the cream from the other areas of the house, but we're going to replace the red that we've been using with more of a deep kitchen blue. But the kitchen in the story became the most sensible place for Bernard to allow Callum to participate in some of his activities. It was away from potential water spillages on his paperwork upstairs and just a short walk inside from the side entrance, which is just off the room. And that was handy because Callum tended to insist on placing a hand on all of the bowls of water as Bernard carried them inside, so splashes did often occur. He pulled in some stools into the room for Callum to sit on and look into the pond water with a magnifying glass that he brought down, and Bernard would then do his genuine tests or whatever he was doing on the countertop. He even provided Callum with a little notebook to write down any of his little observations that he saw in the pond water. And initially Bernard was just humouring him and nurturing an interest that he found to be positive for his son. However, he soon began to teach Callum some genuine aspects of biology, helping him to identify various species of invertebrates and larvae found in the water samples. As he spent more time with Callum doing this, he noticed his son had developed a tendency to panic quite easily. He was often reserved or on edge and would trigger in various moments of emotion. Bernard questioned if spending so much of his life constricted to Anna's quite limited environment had been good for him. Thankfully, he found that placing Callum there in front of the magnifying glass, he would calm down almost instantly. So it became somewhat of a routine, a fixation, and Bernard continued to explain important concepts of biodiversity like competition and a balance of consistency within a large number of species for the best possible chance that some of them might adapt to potential change. And as he taught Callum more and more, Callum's interest grew. He began to somewhat modify the environment within the little bowls of pond water to test how the creatures responded. And Bernard encouraged this as positive questioning nature. So they would gather things around the kitchen like pieces of apple or a chopped grape and plop them into the water, and Callum would observe how the creatures responded. He would place like little obstructions in the bowl or shine a light over it, sometimes a combination of variables, and Callum's curiosity seemed to only grow. And Bernard wasn't sure how and when something different had happened, but he did notice one day that Callum's behaviour had subtly changed. He showed signs of high stress. He held his shoulders in a more tense posture. His eyes would dart as though reacting to a sudden sound that wasn't there, and his responses when being spoken to became more delayed, as though his focus was only always partly present. And that's where we leave the kitchen, so let's have a little look here at the finished result. And we're going to move here to the final area that we're going to do today, and this is the laundry room. Bernard would find himself leaving the kitchen into this room quite often to sort of think and decompress. Bernard was aware of Anna's reclusive behaviour and inability to enjoy their home, but seeing Callum now struggling on top of that, even though he didn't know why, was really heartbreaking for him. So weeks went by and Bernard was sort of keeping watch on Callum and often caught him glancing up at the ceiling as though anxiously expecting something to happen. He would watch him move objects from one location to another with no obvious reasoning, as though somehow enacting his experimenting of obstructions in the pond water within his own environment. Sometimes he would catch him counting in a whisper as he pointed around an area of the house. Callum still wanted to be with the pond samples and in the magnifying glass, scribbling away in his notebook, but his expression was different now while doing it, as though something about his little investigations were more meaningful and quite haunting to Bernard. The only time Callum would seem settled was after spending time with Anna during his schooling. He would approach Bernard with somewhat of a knowing smile, ready to begin his investigating before gradually becoming more unsettled again. So at this point, Bernard realized that he needs to take control of the situation and find out what is going on with Callum and Anna. And he would begin by talking to his wife Anna to try and glean some more information. And that is really the end of Act 1. Act 2 and 3 are going to come out later this week, so you won't have to wait very long for it. But let me know what you think of this sort of different format, and we'll see how this story progresses. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of this new idea. And be kind to yourselves, and I will see you very soon in the next one.